Well, greetings. Here we are again in our generous justice study. And today I actually have an audience of two. And I have sent out a notice to Jubileers that if you would like to be part of the recording aspect of the lesson, it's Thursday mornings at 11. And once we've finished recording the lesson, then we can have a brief discussion time afterwards. This is a study by Timothy Keller, and the concept of the study is that as Christians we are most familiar with linking Jesus to love and mercy and forgiveness and grace, and we have neglected to think in many cases about how Jesus and his grace are linked to justice in this world. And that is the purpose of this study. Isaiah 42:1 says, "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations." So as we continue in this study, we hope that we will begin to see and live into the idea that being the recipients of God's grace should lead to our desire to do deeds of justice within the framework of the relationships and communities that we exist in. Our hymn for today is "Rise Up, O Saints of God." And I have to precede this every time with a "Please excuse my singing." You've never seen me in the choir and never seen me doing solos except on this. This hymn is familiar to you. It used to be "Rise Up, O Men of God," but we have been given the opportunity to include women in this by saying "Rise up, O Saints of God." Rise up, O Saints of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and mind and soul and strength to serve the King of Kings. Rise up, O Saints of God, the kingdom tarries long. Bring in the day of brotherhood and in the night of wrong. We have joys and concerns today, and I have not had any submitted to me and am not aware of any immediate joys and concerns. I have been told that Buddy Blair's graveside service at the VA cemetery for the family is going to be next Tuesday, so keep the family in your prayers for the celebration of Buddy's life. Our opening for today, if you will turn into your lesson, the opening comes from Zechariah and from Matthew. "This is what the Lord Almighty said: Administer true justice. Show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Last week we examined the question of how do we do justice, and there was so much information in that chapter that I had to divide it into two parts. So this is part two of that question: how should we do justice? And last week we looked at 3 levels of doing justice and helping the needy. The list is, the first 2 levels are relief and development, and that's what we spent last week looking at. And the third is social reform, which we're going to look at today. to go back and just refresh your memory a little bit, relief is direct aid to meet an immediate physical or material or economic need. And I would make the example, a lot of you are familiar with Fort Bend Family Promise, and these are families that are currently have no shelter. And so we provide, the different churches have come together in a coalition to provide shelter and to provide meals and hospitality for folks that find themselves in those situations. That's a relief effort. But Fort Bend Family Promise also goes a step further in that development phase of help. And in development, there are staff members at Fort Bend Family Promise that mentor the folks in the program and help them train them for job skills, train them for job searches, and help them link up with resources for job searches, help them with parenting skills, help them with budgeting issues. All of this in the hopes that once they have stable employment and know how to better live within their budget, that they won't find themselves in this situation again and again. Today we're going to be seeking insights into the third level, social reform. And if you look back, one of the stories we talked about in Generous Justice, one of the examples Jesus spoke of was the story of the Good Samaritan. And in that story, think about it just a minute. What level of support did he give to the wounded man he found on the road? Relief, right? The man was wounded and he needed help. And that's what the Samaritan provided, was relief. He treated his wounds, he got him to a safe place and had him bedded down, got him food, got him shelter. And but if you think about it, what if we extended that story and the Good Samaritan was on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho all the time, and every time he was on that road he found somebody wounded and beaten along the road? More than likely he would finally get to the place where he asked himself, and maybe started talking to others about it and asking them, how can we stop this violence? Now there's a lot of answers that are possibilities for that question. For that story, it might be that within the community they develop groups that encourage people not to travel the road alone, to have safe practices. Just like during COVID, we have safe practices that have been lifted up to us. They might have lifted up safe practices. Don't travel that road at night. Don't travel it alone. They might have even tried to secure more protection along that road for people. And someone might have even said, well, what can we do to provide resources for people so that they don't have to rob in order to sustain their life? So there's a variety of answers, but the question itself is really one of social reform. Changes have to be made that step beyond immediate relief or development. Some examples in today's society where social reforms are indicated are criminal justice system, employment practices, educational opportunities, healthcare, housing. The list could go on and on. Now, in other parts of the world, we often hear about horrible acts of social injustice that need to be addressed. Human trafficking or government-sponsored torture and mutilation or murder. But for us, most of the examples of systemic evil or social injustice is a little simpler and more subtle. It looks like, here in America, it might look like failing schools in some areas. It might look like legal inequities. Those are far more common in our society. And the truth of the matter is that our political and economic systems do not always listen to people without money or other forms of social power. The vulnerable and the oppressed need help, but it can't just be, there has to be some relief and development, but it can't just be that. Someone must resist and try to change the legal or political or social systems. Unfortunately, during this period of COVID, we've also in this country been faced with a lot of demonstrations, some of them peaceful and some of them violent, that are protests against what are perceived racial inequities. And these, I was watching a program last night with my husband over riots that were happening in 1968, and it sounded almost identical to the situation we're in now. And there's some back in the 40s, demonstrations back in the 40s and 50s, trying to help establish more equality for people who are oppressed in our country. During this period of time on the news, you may have heard the word systemic or institutional racism or institutional injustice. There are people in America that struggle with inequities, and those might be in the criminal justice system, as I've said before, in the employment practices or in housing or healthcare. We know that during COVID, minorities have a higher percentage of people who are seriously ill with COVID over those who have more economic resources. If we just looked at school systems, in the schools, children of the poor are the largest percentage of failures and dropouts in the educational system. Even here in Fort Bend, where our educational system is lifted up as a good one, there are, if you go into schools in the more affluent neighborhoods of Fort Bend ISD, you will see a vast, diverse community in each of those schools. But if you go into the neighborhoods of Fort Bend County that are economically deprived, the look is much more different. It is a higher percentage of Hispanic and African Americans, and those schools are ones that are struggling every year, year after year, to come up to the standards that are expected in the state of Texas and in Fort Bend County. And we've known for decades that if children are unsuccessful in school, particularly among minorities and poor children, that they are much more likely to be those who end up in prison. When they've done studies of people in prison and found out that a high percentage, if not nearly all of the folks that are in prison, have a low educational background and lack of success in education. And it even has a name. It's called the prison pipeline, and it goes from the school system and the failure of schools to meet the needs of poor children straight to prison. So obviously this is an area that where reform is needed. The truth is the same resources are not allocated to the middle class communities and to wealthy communities over poor ones. And it only takes a little bit of a driving through our neighborhoods. What you see are clean streets and landscaping. And if you drive into poorer neighborhoods not too far away from here, you will see a completely different landscape. Now, there are two groups within Christianity, lots more than that, but for this, there are two groups. Some Christians and Christian communities focus only on individual salvation, and others are more well known for their activity in providing aid and assistance for social reform from their church. Like I said, there's not an agreement on this, because what Christ, the first commission that he gave was that we were to spread the gospel. And so that is definitely a priority for the church. But I'd like to share a story with you so that you can see that salvation alone doesn't always provide the answer for folks who have been living in oppression, generation after generation. This story is told by an urban pastor named Robert Linthicum. And when he was younger, he served as a student intern at a church during the summer in a metropolitan area. And he worked in a government housing project. And one of the children that attended his Bible study was a 14-year-old girl named Eva. And she was very active in their Bible studies. But at one point, she came to him for a private conversation, and she said, "I don't know what to do. There's a gang in our project, and it pushes all the girls into prostitution. And I don't know, they're trying to force me into it, and I don't know what to do." And he just encouraged her, and he urged her not to give in to the demands and to stick with the Bible study. But then his summer internship was over, and he had to leave. And 3 months later, he came back for a visit, and Eva was nowhere in the Bible studies. And he asked about her, and they said, "Well, she hasn't been coming for a while." And so he went to her apartment to check on her. And as soon as she saw him, she burst into tears. And she said, "They got to me, Bob." And he said in his sort of an unempathetic way, "How could you give in?" And she said, "I didn't know how to resist, because they told me if I didn't, they would beat my father up." And they did, beat him up badly. And so I didn't see how I had a choice. I had to protect my family, so I gave in. That's an example of how a system of inequities can be obstacles to salvation. Jeremiah 29:7, and this happened to be one of the mission statements that we've had here at our church since Chapel has been with us, and it reads, "Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." Chapel used that to inspire us to make sure that we were looking at the needs in the community around us and how we, as Christ Church, could make the community a better place to live. So what do we do if you're in our situation and you're not located right in the middle of an area of poverty? Well, the first thing one of the things we did was began to inquire of local leadership, what can we do to make the neighborhood a better place to live? We talked to the school system about what are your needs and what could we do to help. And a lot of our missions have been shaped by that. The other thing we can do is we can find churches and ministries and even organizations that are effective in poor neighborhoods or in poor countries, and align ourselves with them and offer the kind of support that they say they need to carry out their ministries in effective ways. We did this with Pastor Ronnie in Africa, and we regularly meet with him and talk to him about what he needs to make his effective ministry even better and more powerful. So what we have is that many Christians believe that the call of the church is to preach the word, which it is, to evangelize and to build up believers. But as we've talked about before, coming to faith, coming to an understanding of our receipt of God's grace, leads us to acts of love and compassion and mercy. When a church decides to meet the needs of others, there's going to be it's not an easy business. It gets a little messy. There's questions like, how much should we help? Whom should we help? In what way do we help? Questions might be, are there disadvantaged children that need tending to in our area? Children that are physically or mentally disabled or that are failing in schools? Are there elderly who have specific needs? Are the chronically ill that need help? And as I mentioned before, many of our missions come through conversations with Fort Bend ISD about what children need. And in your lesson, there is a list of missions that we have established at Christ Church. And I challenge you to read through this list on your own and think about how many of these have to do with relief for immediate physical needs and how many of them are development that are trying to lift people out of their situation so that it's not a repetitive experience for them. When you look at that list, you're going to see a lot of programs that have been developed for children, backpack buddies, helping a hurting child, Operation Christmas Child, Supply Our Students, Souls for Souls. These were all, and tutorial programs, these were all developed after conversations with the leadership in Fort Bend about the kinds of needs that they need help with within the school system. Luke 6:32 through 36 says, "If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. But if you lend to those whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be the children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked." That's us. "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." One of the basic principles in this scripture is that we should not be generous and giving because we expect acts of gratitude in return. Evangelism and social justice do not have to be in competition with each other in the life of the Christian community. They should exist in connection with each other and in a balanced relationship. The gospel produces a concern for the oppressed. Deeds of justice lend credibility to the preaching of the gospel. So it works both ways. So as those who love God, the most loving thing we can do is to help others come to saving grace. And sometimes that comes through being responsive to the physical and material and economic needs of others. I know as a teacher, we used to have this saying that no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And we know that this was a principle in the early church, because in the early days of Christianity, Gentiles noticed how well Christians cared for people in need. And that made them open to the gospel message. When a community perceives a church as existing strictly and only for itself and its own members, the preaching of that church will not resonate with others, not resonate with the outsiders. But if neighbors see church members loving their neighbors with sacrificial deeds of compassion, they will be much more open to the message of the church, the message of salvation. If you wish to share your faith with needy people and you do nothing about the painful conditions in which they live, you will fail to show them the entirety of Christ's beauty. The church's mission is to evangelize and nurture believers in Christian community. And as it does this work, it produces people who engage in life in ways that change society. Churches definitely should carry out ministries of relief and development in their community and beyond to show the world God's character and to spread His love. The social reforms that are often needed as a foundational platform for social justice, these are bigger, more ambitious projects. And for the most part, they are best tackled by Christians as they participate in community organizations established to bring about justice for all. The truth is, the church cannot be and do everything. God can, but the church is an organization. Our first priority is to bring people to Christ. And within that, we will find that we have a heart for helping others. The social injustice and social reforms are such a big project that it's very hard for a church to focus on that as well as evangelism. And so the premise here is that individual Christians, having received the grace of Christ and having been raised in their hearts the issue of helping the oppressed, some of those social reforms issues have to be carried out by Christians as they interact in the community itself. Doing justice means striking a balance between word and deed. As the hymn, "Lead on, O King Eternal," says, "For not with swords loud clashing, nor the roll of stirring drums, but with deeds of love and mercy, the heavenly kingdom comes." Before we read our closing together or sing it together, there are scriptures at the end of the lesson for next week's lesson, and I encourage you to take a look at those ahead of time. And I would love for you to send me your joys and concerns so that I can share. When I talk to members of the class individually, they'll say, well, what's going on with so-and-so and what's happening? And we are concerned about each other. So if you have some news to share and you need some prayer support from people in the class, let us know, and we'll be with you in that. Our closing is God be with you. God be with you till we meet again. By his counsel's guide uphold you. With his sheep securely fold you. God be with you till we meet again. Till we meet. Till we meet. Till we meet at Jesus' feet. Till we meet, till we meet. God be with you till we meet again.